Your first awakening cracked the world open. It showed you that the life you'd been living was built on borrowed beliefs, inherited expectations, and performances you never consciously chose. That was devastating enough. But what's happening to you now is something else entirely. Because the second awakening doesn't crack the world open, it cracks you open. And the version of you that emerged from that first awakening, the one you thought was finally the real you, is exactly what's being dismantled this time. Jung spent decades mapping the stages of psychological transformation, and what he found disturbed even him. He discovered that the first awakening most people experience isn't actually an awakening at all. It's a preparation, a clearing of the ground. The real transformation, what Jung considered genuine individuation, doesn't begin until a second wave arrives, one that feels nothing like the first, one that targets the very identity you built from your initial awakening. And most people who go through it believe something has gone terribly wrong, because everything they thought they'd already resolved is surfacing again, deeper, uglier, and more disorienting than before. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this second phase of awakening, why it feels like regression when it's actually progression, what's actually being dismantled inside you and why it has to happen, and how to recognize that the confusion and pain you're experiencing right now isn't a sign that you've lost your way. It's a sign that you finally found the deeper path. To understand why the second awakening is so different from the first, you have to understand what the first one actually was. Jung observed that most people's initial awakening follows a predictable pattern. Something in their life collapses, a relationship ends, a career falls apart, a health crisis forces them to stop, or the slow accumulation of inauthenticity just becomes unbearable and something inside snaps. Whatever the catalyst, the result is the same. The person suddenly sees through the life they've been living. They recognize the persona they've been wearing. They see how much of their identity was constructed to please others. They start understanding concepts like boundaries, shadow work, inner child healing. They read books, find communities, maybe start meditating or journaling. They feel like they've woken up from a long sleep, and in many ways, they have. But here's what Jung recognized that most people miss. The first awakening is primarily about seeing through the external world, seeing through society's expectations, seeing through toxic relationship dynamics, seeing through family systems that were dysfunctional, seeing through career paths chosen out of obligation rather than calling. The first awakening turns your critical awareness outward. You become conscious of how the world shaped you without your consent. And that feels revolutionary, because it is, to a degree. You're no longer unconsciously following scripts. You're making choices based on awareness rather than conditioning. You set boundaries. You leave situations that drain you. You stop performing for people who don't see you. You build what feels like an authentic life. And for a while, maybe months, maybe years, this feels like enough. This feels like the destination. Jung would have told you it's not. It's the trailhead. The second awakening begins when the awareness that was pointed outward during the first phase starts turning inward. And what it finds there is infinitely more disturbing than what it found in the external world. Because now, you're not seeing through other people's illusions. You're seeing through your own. This is what makes the second awakening feel like a betrayal. You did the work. You went to therapy. You set the boundaries. You left the toxic situations. You built a new identity around consciousness, around healing, around being someone who sees clearly. And now that identity is being pulled apart. The spiritual self, the healed self, the awakened self, the one who knows better now, is being revealed as another construction, a more sophisticated one, a more convincing one, but a construction nonetheless. Jung would have called this the dissolution of the spiritual persona. During the first awakening, most people don't just shed their old identity, they build a new one. They go from unconscious performer to conscious spiritual seeker, from people pleaser to boundary setter, from someone asleep to someone awakened. And this new identity feels so much more authentic than the old one that they mistake it for their true self. Any identity built in reaction to another identity is still reactive. It's still defined by what it's not rather than what it is. The healed identity is defined by not being wounded anymore. The boundaried identity is defined by not being a doormat anymore. The awakened identity is defined by not being asleep anymore. All of these are improvements. None of them are the self. The self, in Jung's framework, isn't an identity at all. It's the totality of who you are, including the parts that don't fit neatly into any identity, including the contradictions, including the darkness that your spiritual persona learned to hide more skillfully than your original persona ever did. And the second awakening is when the self starts demanding to be recognized. Not the curated version, not the healed version, the full, terrifying, paradoxical, unmanageable whole. You'll know the second awakening has started because it has a signature that's unmistakable once you understand it. The first sign is that practices that used to work stop working. The meditation that once brought peace now brings restlessness or dread. The journaling that once created clarity now feels hollow or performative. The spiritual community that once felt like home now feels like another cage. Not because these things were wrong, but because they were scaffolding for the first awakening. And scaffolding has to come down once the structure can stand on its own. This terrifies people because they interpret it as regression. They think they're losing their spiritual connection. They think they've done something wrong. They try harder, meditate longer, read more books, attend more workshops. But the hollowness doesn't fill because it's not a deficit. It's an evacuation. Something inside you is clearing space for what comes next. And what comes next requires emptiness, not more accumulation. The second sign is the return of material you thought you'd already healed. Wounds you processed in therapy resurface. Patterns you broke come back in new disguises. Anger you thought you'd released shows up again, rawer than before. And this feels like failure, like proof that the first awakening didn't work, like you've been fooling yourself about how much you've actually changed. The material that resurfaces during the second awakening isn't the same material you dealt with the first time. It's a deeper layer of the same wound. The first awakening let you process the surface. You understood the pattern intellectually. You set boundaries around it. You changed your behavior. But the root, the part of the wound that lives in your body, in your nervous system, in the pre-verbal architecture of your psyche, wasn't reachable during the first phase. You didn't have the capacity yet. Now you do. And that capacity is exactly why it's surfacing. The third sign is a profound and almost unbearable loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You can be surrounded by people who love you and still feel it. This loneliness isn't social, it's existential. It's the loneliness of realizing that the journey you're on now can't be shared, explained, or understood by anyone who hasn't entered this same territory. Your first awakening had books and podcasts and communities that mapped the experience. The second awakening has almost no language for what's happening because so few people let it happen. Most people hit this phase and retreat back into the comfort of their spiritual identity rather than letting it be dismantled. The fourth sign is that your relationship to truth changes in a way that makes your previous relationship to truth look almost childish. During the first awakening, truth meant seeing through external lies, recognizing manipulation, identifying toxic dynamics, calling things what they were. That felt brave and radical. During the second awakening, truth means seeing through your own lies, the subtle ways you still perform consciousness, the ways your healing became an identity you defend rather than a process you surrender to, the spiritual ego that insists on being further along than you actually are. This level of self-honesty makes the first awakening's truth-telling look like a warm-up exercise. Jung documented a fifth sign that he found particularly significant. People in the second awakening develop what he described as a tolerance for paradox that simply doesn't exist during the first phase. During the first awakening, you see clearly. You know who's toxic and who's safe. You understand the dynamics. Everything sorts into categories: good and bad, healthy and unhealthy, conscious and unconscious. But the second awakening dissolves these clean categories. You start recognizing that the person who wounded you also gave you something essential, that your worst pattern also protected something sacred, that the darkness you've been fighting contains gifts you desperately need. Holding these contradictions without resolving them into simple narratives is the psychological work of the second awakening, and it's exponentially harder than the clear seeing of the first phase. If you're sitting with all of this, and something in your chest is tightening because you recognize it, because this is the unnamed thing that's been happening to you, then what comes next matters deeply. This is exactly the territory where Jung's work becomes less about theory and more about having something solid to hold when the ground beneath you is shifting. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built for exactly this kind of moment. The kind where you need to go inward, but you need a path to follow so the inward journey doesn't become free fall. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, and let's continue. Because understanding what's happening is only the beginning. Understanding why it has to happen this way is where the real shift occurs. What Jung discovered about the mechanism behind the second awakening is what makes it so radically different from the first. The first awakening is driven by the ego becoming conscious. The ego wakes up to its conditioning, sees the programs it's been running, and starts making different choices. This is valuable. This is growth. But it's still the ego driving the process. The ego is the one deciding to heal. The ego is the one setting boundaries. The ego is the one building the new, more conscious identity. And the ego feels great about all of this because it's still in control. It just swapped one operating system for a better one. The second awakening is driven by something entirely different. Jung called it the self, and he was careful to distinguish it from the ego. The self is the organizing center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious. It's not the identity you've constructed, it's the intelligence beneath all identity. And when the self initiates the second awakening, it does so by undermining the ego's control, not destroying the ego, decentralizing it. This is why the second awakening feels like losing your mind. Because from the ego's perspective, you are. The ego built a beautiful, conscious, awakened identity, and now something is taking it apart. The ego panics. It tries to reassert control. It looks for new frameworks, new teachers, new practices that will restore the sense of knowing where you are and where you're going. But the self isn't interested in giving the ego a new map. The self is interested in the ego learning to walk without one. Jung observed this dynamic playing out in his patients with striking consistency. They'd arrive having done significant psychological work already. They weren't beginners. They understood their patterns, their wounds, their family dynamics. They'd been through one major transformation and come out the other side stronger. And then something started happening that they couldn't explain within any framework they'd learned. They described feeling like a stranger in their own life. Not because their life was wrong, but because the person living it no longer felt solid. The identity they'd constructed, even the healthy one, even the hard-won one, started feeling like a costume. Not because it was false, but because it was partial. They were more than the person they'd decided to be, and the more was demanding expression. This experience was often accompanied by a strange and paradoxical grief. Not grief for the old self that died during the first awakening. That grief made sense to people. But grief for the new self, the awakened self, the healed self, mourning an identity that was genuinely good, genuinely hard-earned, genuinely more conscious than what came before, but still not the full truth. This grief confuses people because you're not supposed to mourn becoming better. You're not supposed to feel loss about growth. But Jung understood that every expansion requires a death, and the death of a good identity can be more painful than the death of a bad one. Because at least with the bad one, you were motivated to let it go. What replaces the identity that dissolves during the second awakening isn't another identity. This is the part that's nearly impossible to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. After the first awakening, you know who you are. After the second, you stop needing to know. Not because you're confused, because you've arrived at something more fluid, more responsive, more alive than any fixed identity could be. Jung described individuation not as becoming a particular person, but as becoming capable of being whoever the moment requires, without losing your center. The individuated person isn't rigid in their self-concept. They can be soft and fierce, analytical and intuitive, social and solitary, serious and playful. Not performing these qualities, but accessing them genuinely as the situation demands. This flexibility horrified the ego during the first awakening, because the ego needed to know who it was. During the second awakening, The ego learns that who you are isn't a destination. It's a living, breathing process that changes shape without losing substance. This is why the second awakening can look like breakdown to people who only went through the first one. They'll watch you questioning things you used to be certain about. They'll see you releasing practices and beliefs that defined you. They'll notice you becoming less predictable, less easy to categorize, less committed to the identity they knew you as. And they'll worry. They'll think you're regressing. They'll try to pull you back to the version of you that made sense to them. Jung warned about this. He found that the people most threatened by someone's second awakening were often the people who celebrated their first one. Because the first awakening created an identity that others could relate to and understand. The boundaried empath, the conscious partner, the healing warrior. These are recognizable archetypes. People know how to interact with them. But the person emerging from the second awakening doesn't fit archetypes anymore. They're becoming something that defies easy categorization, and that makes people deeply uncomfortable. The loneliness of the second awakening has a different quality than the loneliness of the first. During the first awakening, you were lonely because you saw truth while everyone else was performing. You could at least point to what was wrong. During the second awakening, you're lonely because you're in a process that has no clear enemy, no obvious dysfunction, no external villain. You can't blame the narcissist this time. You can't point to the toxic family. The dismantling is happening inside you, initiated by you, and that's infinitely harder to explain to anyone. "I'm falling apart and nothing external is wrong" isn't a narrative that gets much support. But Jung would tell you this phase has a purpose that the first awakening could never accomplish. The first awakening freed you from the world's conditioning. The second frees you from your own. And your own conditioning is far more sophisticated, far more entrenched, and far more invisible than anything the world imposed on you. Because you chose it, you built it deliberately, you reinforced it with awareness and intention. Taking apart something you built unconsciously is hard. Taking apart something you built on purpose, something you're proud of, something that genuinely served you, requires a kind of courage that most people never develop. There's another dimension to the second awakening that Jung explored extensively, and it has to do with the relationship between consciousness and the body. The first awakening is largely cognitive. You understand differently, you see differently, you think differently. The insights land in your mind and change how you interpret reality. But the second awakening moves into the body, into the nervous system, into the cellular memory of experiences that happened before you had language. The second awakening often involves physical symptoms that have no medical explanation. Exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, tension that massage doesn't release, waves of emotion that have no narrative attached to them. Your body is processing what your mind processed during the first awakening, but at a deeper level. The intellectual understanding of your wound is being replaced by somatic integration, and somatic integration doesn't follow the mind's timeline. It follows its own rhythm, which is slower, messier, and completely beyond the ego's control. People in this phase needed to develop a fundamentally different relationship with not knowing. The first awakening rewarded knowledge. The more you understood about your patterns, your attachment style, your family dynamics, the more empowered you felt. Knowledge was liberation. But the second awakening requires surrendering knowledge, not because knowledge is wrong, but because clinging to what you know prevents you from encountering what you don't know yet. And what you don't know yet is precisely what the second awakening is trying to reveal. This surrender isn't passive. Jung was adamant about that. It's not spiritual bypassing dressed up as acceptance. It's an active, terrifying choice to let the process move through you without controlling where it goes. It's sitting with the dissolution of your certainties and not reaching for new ones just because the emptiness is uncomfortable. It's trusting that the intelligence orchestrating this dismantling knows something your ego doesn't. Jung described this trust not as faith in some external force, but as faith in the psyche itself. He observed that the psyche has its own wisdom, its own trajectory toward wholeness, and when you stop fighting that trajectory, when you stop trying to manage it or speed it up or make it more comfortable, it moves with a precision that the ego could never achieve. The ego plans, the self unfolds, and unfolding requires exactly the kind of surrender that the second awakening demands. What emerges on the other side of this process isn't enlightenment. Jung would have been suspicious of anyone claiming that. What emerges is something more honest and more sustainable. A person who doesn't need to be awakened because they've stopped defining themselves in opposition to sleep. A person who doesn't need to perform consciousness because consciousness has become their ground rather than their identity. A person who can sit with the full catastrophe of being human, the beauty and the horror, the wisdom and the foolishness, the compassion and the selfishness, without needing to resolve it into a tidy narrative about who they are. Jung called this the transcendent function. Not transcending humanity, but transcending the need to choose between opposing parts of yourself. The ability to hold tension without collapsing it, to be wounded and powerful simultaneously, to know deeply and not know at all at the same time. This capacity doesn't develop during the first awakening because the first awakening is still operating in binaries: asleep versus awake, toxic versus healthy, false self versus true self. The second awakening dissolves the binaries themselves. If you're in this right now, if the ground beneath your feet is shifting and nothing you used to rely on is working the way it did, Jung would tell you that you're not falling apart, you're falling together. For the first time, perhaps, all the pieces of you, the acceptable and the unacceptable, the light and the shadow, the healed and the still wounded, are being gathered into something that doesn't need to exclude any of them. This doesn't mean it isn't excruciating. It is. Jung never pretended that individuation was comfortable. He described it as the most demanding work a human being can undertake, but he also recognized it as the only work that leads to genuine wholeness, rather than a better decorated version of fragmentation. The second awakening isn't a punishment for not getting the first one right. It's a deepening that's only possible because you got the first one right enough. You built the psychological strength to survive this. You developed the self-awareness to witness it. You cultivated the honesty required to face what it reveals. The first awakening was the training. The second is the real thing. And here's what Jung found most remarkable about people who allowed the second awakening to complete its work. They stopped seeking. Not because they'd found all the answers, but because the frantic energy that drove the seeking had burned itself out. They became still in a way that wasn't passive or resigned. It was the stillness of someone who's finally stopped running from themselves. Someone who's seen their own depth and chosen to inhabit it rather than manage it from a safe distance. These people didn't radiate the shiny, performative peace that first awakening spiritual personas often project. They radiated something quieter and far more powerful. A groundedness that came from having survived their own dissolution and discovered that what remained was enough. More than enough. That what remained when every identity was stripped away wasn't emptiness, but presence. Not a concept of presence they'd learned in meditation. Actual, embodied, undeniable presence. Jung spent his entire career trying to articulate what this presence was. He circled it with concepts: shadow integration, the transcendent function, the self, individuation. But he knew that no concept could capture it fully because it wasn't a concept. It was an experience. The experience of being fully here, fully human, fully alive, without needing to be anything more than exactly what you are in this moment. That's what the second awakening is moving you toward. Not a better version of yourself, not a higher consciousness, not a spiritual achievement, just you. Stripped of every mask, every identity, every performance, every narrative about who you should be. Just you, meeting reality without a buffer, and discovering that this meeting is what you've been searching for through every book, every practice, every teacher, every awakening. You're not losing what you gained in the first awakening. You're outgrowing its container. The insights remain. The awareness remains. The boundaries and the discernment and the self-knowledge all remain. But they stop being your identity and start being your tools. And there's a world of difference between being defined by your awareness and simply using it to navigate life with honesty and grace. If something in this reached you, if you're in the middle of this unnamed dismantling and you've been searching for confirmation that you're not going backwards, then what you need right now isn't more information. It's a way to be with yourself through this. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for this kind of passage. 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's work designed not to give you answers, but to help you ask the questions that this second awakening is demanding you face. Click below to get true self-discovery.